Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that I found at my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. They might have interesting or good books or just books that tickle your fancy. I checked out this book at random, so I wasn't really knowledgeable about the quality, and I have quite a few things to say about it. It is a book about young love in Philadelphia, or young lust in Philadelphia. I am referring to Flyy Girl by Omar Tyree, which was published in 1993. For those who don't know, Omar Tyree is an author who is known for writing Black literature. I believe publishers refer to it as an urban classic novel here, but they a lot of other publishers refer to Black focused books as urban novels or something like that. I saw it with Hood Rat, another book that I read in the recent past, but wasn't a fan of. And it's really weird because this story takes place in suburban Philadelphia. Why is it called urban? Urban literature in that case. I think it's just a name that people ascribe to black writers. But Omar Tyree is a modern, is a Black writer writing about modern Black individuals and the city and whatnot. He frequently writes about those themes of love, his own experience growing up, and the ideas of greed and lust and stuff like that. He also wrote a biography of Washington D.C. Mayor Marion Barry, along with Marion Barry, which is very interesting. But some people criticized it as not focusing on all the stuff that Marion Barry did wrong, but probably wasn't the focus of the book. But yeah, he's a very interesting writer with some interesting way of saying things that I'll talk about later in the book. And this one seems to be on the verge of being turned into a movie, but it's clearly been in production for some time. And he's won some acclaim for his work as well, which is interesting. I don't know too much else about Omar Tyree besides what I've read here, and not a lot of people talk about him outside of Black literature circles, unfortunately. But without further ado, let's talk about Flyy Girl. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Flyy Girl focuses on a young Black woman, or a young Black girl named Tracy Ellison. It's pretty much her early teen years through when she graduates high school, as she grows up in suburban Philadelphia. Unfortunately, her parents are in conflict, as her father feels struggled or smothered in this relationship that he's in with his wife, Tracy's mother, and so he decides to leave and comes back every so often to give the family money and support and whatnot. But Tracy is growing up without that father and is dealing with issues of not getting that attention that she wants or something like that. And also struggling a little bit in school and her love life. Also, this story takes place in the 1980s, which is something you don't really find out until 200 pages into the story. Also, next door, there's another family dealing with their own troubles. Mercedes, a young girl, is rebelling against her very controlling father, dating boys behind his back, and when he finds out, he threatens to beat her, but she decides that she's going to move out. And she seems to have some success in doing so, and she visits every so often and tells the family that she's doing great, but we don't really see what is actually happening to her until later in the story. Tracy begins becoming interested in boys, young men, and she begins dating a boy named Aaron, but she's clearly using him to learn more about football and whatnot, and to up her flirting skills. She eventually ditches him and flirts with other boys, and they all start competing for her attention, and she's wearing very stylistic clothes for the time, so more boys are getting or like paying attention to her as a result. Eventually, although putting it off for some time, she does eventually decide to have sex, knowing that that's what the boys are after. And she has sex with a troublesome young man named Victor, who is very manipulative and trying to get sex out of her. Tracy is aware of that, but she also doesn't mind because Victor is super hot and the sex is great, and she tries to pursue something more with Victor, but he's not interested and strings her along for a little bit before they kind of go their separate ways, although she sees him throughout the story. Meanwhile, back at Mercedes' old house, Rahima is growing up as well and is interested in boys, but she's more interested in her books because that's what her controlling father wants. And Rahima goes out with this boy named Bruce, who's a total square, and she tries to have a relationship, but she just pushes him to the side. And Tracy picks up Bruce and tries to date him more. She wants to be manipulative towards him and gain things, but he doesn't really seem to be a good lover or anything like that. So she just strings him along and is only really her friend, but he seems very desperate to have sex and do other things, but that keeps their kind of friendship at odds at times too. Tracy develops a relationship with an abusive kind of criminal boy named Timmy, who steals things, but eventually he's arrested. And then she also enters into a relationship with a boy named Cash, who's a drug dealer and who her mother warns her about, but she decides to pursue that relationship. Although he again isn't that great of a lover, which is unfortunate for Tracy, and she seeks ways out of the relationship because of those kind of factors right there. We also see more into Rahima's poor love life. She's getting more acne on her face, and she's feeling a lot of pressure from her father again. And while Tracy is hanging out at one of Cash's drug dens during the crack cocaine epidemic in Philadelphia, she stumbles into Mercedes, who's addicted to drugs and is having a lot of problems because of it, basically learning that Mercedes has been lying this entire time. And she tells her mother about it and kind of has a moment of realization that this life that she's on of living fast and having sex with as many boys as she possibly can, or trying to get what she can out of these boys, is going to kind of be devastating for her eventually. Eventually, Tracy's dad decides to move back in for the betterment of the family. And Tracy starts dating a boy in college named Carl, but they're at odds with one another because Tracy thinks that Carl is going to constantly cheat on her and whatnot, and so he just thinks she's too immature, and they eventually break it off. Mercedes returns home, and her father has a sort of moment of realization too, where he realizes that he can break the cycle of mistreatment and abuse and be a real father for his children, and he commits to doing that. Victor, meanwhile, who has been popping up throughout the story, is finally arrested for his criminal behavior, and he writes to Tracy from jail saying that he's found Jesus through the Muslim Brotherhood and has become more aware of the systemic inequality that exists for black men, and he's committed to changing and being there for Tracy when he finally gets out of jail. Tracy also confronts her dad and tells him about Victor, noting that there were a lot of similarities between the two, and it might be the case that she was seeking Victor to get attention from her father, or to get the attention that her father wasn't really giving her, and her dad just comforts her and lets her know that he'll try better and that he's really pushing for her to go to college to have a better life. And then in the epilogue, as the story comes to a close, we see Tracy's letter to her father, where she notes that she's going to college, everything's good for her, but she's going to wait for Victor when he gets out of jail, and she knows that it's going to take a lot of work for the relationship to work, but she's committed to that because she feels that Victor is the one for her. terms of analysis, this is a very bizarre story. One of the weirdest stories that I've ever read, and that mainly pertains to the writing. Not so much the themes or stuff that are explored. I feel like it's a very, traditional story of love for teenagers, kind of aimed at teenagers, but I think it's I think it's more aimed at men, at being something for men to consume, unfortunately. And I think Omar Tyree has pretty much said that in the interviews and statements that he's made about the books. One of the ideas that Tyree tries to present in Flyy Girl is that of love and attention, seeking attention and love in relationships. Because Tracy is seeking love and seeking relationships throughout the story in order to find the boy, the man that is right for her. And it's proving to be somewhat difficult by the emotions that Tracy is going through, and also the what the boys want in this story as compared to what she probably wants. But what Tracy craves even more than this love and this lust and all of that is that of attention. She loves being paid attention to by these boys, and realizes that flirting with them is going to get her that attention that she really craves. But once she gets that attention, she moves on, which I'll get to in a moment. But there's an interesting quote where this is kind of hinted at or discussed, and let me read it to you. Nevertheless, Tracy continued to long for his attention as she watched his every move out of the corner of her eye while pretending not to. Every few minutes, a girl or two would flock to Victor, and he would say a few words and go on about his business, which at the time was playing basketball with his friends. No girl seemed able to keep his attention for any length of time, and arguing would only make him ignore them, just like with Tracy's father. Tracy smiled, reflecting on their similarities, which is very interesting because I think Tyree is very blunt in what exactly Tracy wants out of this. She notes if for most boys it's like getting attention, and if she doesn't get that or if she gets that attention, she moves on. But for Tracy, Victor seems to represent something more interesting, something more elaborate. Whereas other boys will pay her attention, Victor will give her a very basic amount. And so she pursues Victor because she knows he's going to provide her attention, but there's never going to be a complete focus on her. She's craving something from her father that she's not really getting. And so the way that she pursues that is through her father. It's very Freudian, and I know that can come off as pretty hack at times, but I do think Tyree is saying something pretty interesting here, noting the connection between the father, but also if Tracy gets that attention that she wants, it'll never be enough. Not until she finally resolves the inherent conflict with her father. And so because of that, she's pursuing increasingly more challenging targets. Victor, in that case, who's never really going to give her the full attention because he's a player. Also Cash and Timmy, who are criminals and who she's never going to completely be allowed to be with, because eventually, the cops will take her, or the streets will kill them, as was typical at the time. But what's also interesting is how there seems to be no real resolution to this. Although she does resolve the conflict with her father, she still pursues Victor. But Victor's still a challenge in that he's in prison. And once he gets out of prison, there's going to be the question of, is he really going to change? He's joined the Muslim Brotherhood and he's committed to fighting injustice in the system. But is that actually true? Or did he just change his name because that's what, is stereotypical of black men in jail, what was expected of him in order to survive in a tough environment. I honestly think he maybe hasn't changed, and he's just telling Tracy what she wants to hear, because she's the only woman who's gonna attempt to stick by him. And so she'll never really get that attention that she wants, but maybe that's how Tracy pursues love here. Another interesting aspect of this story is that of teenage masculine bravado. Teenagers are normally loudmouth, wild people. Teenage boys in particular wanting to impress others in order to improve their own reputation and whatnot. And Tracy is chasing after boys, and these boys seek to impress one another other to show off what they're accomplishing in their short lifespan already. Like, they talk of sexual victories, they talk of their street smarts, they talk of how they're able to flirt and how what they're able to accomplish through their flirting. It's very interesting because that's how teenagers act, and we're seeing it through the eyes of Tracy, who's aware that these boys are flirting and want this out of her, but she's willing to pursue it because in a way she also wants that, she knows that if they think that they have the upper hand, she can get anything that they want out of them, which is very manipulative when you think about it. It's very absurd, but I like how Omar Tyree is leaning on his own childhood, as he said before, in order to accurately portray how young black teenagers might be. Of course, it does also come off a little absurd and caricature-like, because it seems like these teenagers have dialogue that no one would actually say. It's very repetitive. He's very clearly leaning into maybe what your expectations of a black teenager might sound like. And so at times it doesn't really feel authentic. It feels more like he's just trying to hype it up for perhaps a white audience or something like that, or for the black men in the audience who might want to be like, oh yeah, we were very, peppy and loud and whatnot during our youth. It's interesting because Tyree has said he was writing for himself while doing this, and his fellow black men who might remember that past, but as a byproduct, women became interested in this story, and I fail to see how women would become interested in this story, because it does seem more like based on those caricatures and less focused on the women's side of things and more on what Tyree assumes women are thinking here. And that leads me to my next problem, my next real the series of problems with the story, and it's that of the bizarre writing. Tyree writes like an alien just discovering human language, which is probably one of the meanest things I've ever said about a writer, but it's scattered throughout this story. Just writing that makes you go, huh? What was he going for here? Writing that is more like, instead of showing and telling, it's telling and not showing. It's just saying, here's what these characters are feeling, here are their emotions. I don't want to do any actual work. And so it just comes off as the most bizarre, poorly written type of book that just leaves you flabbergasted as how someone could as someone who could reach that kind of point. Allow me to read you another interesting quote from this. Crack cocaine was not on the popular scene in Tracy's neighborhood until the end of that summer of 1986. A few boys sold marijuana and beer, but cocaine was new, highly addictive, and in more demand. It was also the most profitable. It became an achievement for a girl to have a drug-dealing boyfriend. The status, the glamour, and the money were beyond compare for teenagers. And that's really just bizarre, because it makes an assumption about this Philadelphia neighborhood that I don't think is really true. I don't think there was an accomplishment to have a drug-dealing boyfriend. I think people were scared or knew the dangers of that, even if it came with money. But given I'm not from that neighborhood, Tyree is, so maybe he knows more than me, but it just seems wrong to write it that way. And to say crack cocaine was not on the popular scene in Tracy's neighborhood. Who writes like that? There's a more clever way to write that, and Tyree is choosing the most bizarre, elaborate way to write things in this story, and to write it in a way where he's just telling us the emotions rather than letting us discover it himself. It comes off very superficial and very very weird in how he chooses to say things, as I've been saying here. But worse than that, there's these confused messages about what exactly Tyree is trying to say, because at times he tries to paint Mercedes and Tracy as the victims in the story, and he's trying to make Rahima out to be some sort of square, but at other times he wants us to sympathize with them, but it really seems like he wants us to hate them for some reason, especially the way that Tracy is written, because it seems like she's like a villain in this story, the way she's manipulating boys at times. It does come off a bit misogynistic because that messaging is so confused. I feel like a more competent writer would have been able to, portray a gray area there without just coming off as saying, Tracy is a bit of a monster here. I don't know why. Like, I don't think Tyree is misogynistic, but I do think that he had a lot of assumptions about the women that he grew up with, the young girls, and it's coming through here in a way that feels incredibly sexist. And I don't I don't know why no one stopped him and said, hey, maybe you should adjust this because it's coming off a bit like you hate women, even though you probably don't. And this story also has problems in that it generates a bunch of ghost themes that don't show up until way later in the story, even though there's no real setup for it. Like, we don't really find out when the story is taking place until like 200 pages into the story. Like, he might mention a few things, but he never really provides like an established footing for where in time this story takes place. And so when he suddenly starts talking about the drug epidemic, even though he laid no groundwork for it, like it's bizarre and it comes out of nowhere. And then when later in the story he starts talking about how Tracy cares about Africa and the systemic injustice towards black people in America, it's like, where does that itself come from? Apparently Tracy cares about poetry and all that, but she doesn't care about school throughout the entire story. In fact, she gets suspended a couple times. Like that desire for Tracy to care about Africa and all that seems like something Tyree put in there as a way to, just throw a bunch of ideas at the wall and see what stuck. But it's nothing. It doesn't stick. Nothing really sticks. It's just a pile of ideas that he used in the story without actually laying any of the groundwork for it. So, like, yeah, your character can care about Africa and your heritage and the struggle, but you have to work towards getting us there. And it doesn't really seem like any of the characters care about the struggle until suddenly Tracy is talking about it like 50 pages before the story ends, and it doesn't seem like there's any actual work to get us there. So it feels like a ghost theme, like a bunch of ideas popping up out of nowhere in an effort to say, hey, I was trying to tell a fascinating story here. And the biggest problem with this is that somehow it makes this writing, it makes this story worse than anything that Meg Cabot has written. If you're familiar with my channel, you've seen or my review on Meg Cabot books, and specifically how Meg Cabot doesn't really seem to make choices in her writing, or doesn't seem to try to do anything of substance in her stories, avoiding conflict at all costs. And this is worse than that, because he doesn't seem to be saying anything for the 500 pages that he's writing. He just seems to be telling a story about Tracy and her love life without any major conflict. Sure, there's the Victor Tracy story. Sure, there's Timmy and Cash and the struggles that she's having. But there's no real substance. He just moves on from boyfriend to boyfriend to boyfriend until somehow the story just ends, and Victor writes her that letter. And so there doesn't seem to be any conflict here, anything of real substance, and it comes off as worse than the things that I've seen Meg Cabot write about, because at least there is ideas there. At least she's trying to say something, even if she is avoiding conflict. Here, there's no conflict to even avoid. It just seems like a story that just goes on and on and on until it ends, and it's a real struggle to get through at times. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Flyy Girl by Omar Tyree. It's a weird, confusing, bizarre type of story. I don't recommend it to you out there. It's going to be one of those rare videos where I say, hey, this is actually really bad. Never read it. And not that I didn't want to enjoy it. I was really hoping that Tyree was going somewhere, but the longer it went on, the more bizarre the writing became, the more confusing the messaging became. And, it's hard to recommend something like that. And that's unfortunate, because I've come across two urban novels, as the publisher would call them, that I haven't really liked. And I really want to like modern Black literature, but I haven't really found a story that really has drawn my attention like that yet. But hopefully, as time goes on, I'll discover more stories that do scratch that itch that I'm looking for. It's just that Flyy Girl was not that story, and I doubt that Omar Tyree's other writing will be. If you read Flyy Girl before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Let's have a discussion about this. If you think it might be good, actually, I'd love to hear why you think that. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author or this book if they don't know already. Join the Discord if you want to have more conversation about literature or whatnot. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and Philadelphia-based travels. Farewell.